So I'm very happy to meet you and to see you online. So I'm trained as an historian of what we call the early modern period of French and European history. That is the period from the Renaissance to the French Revolution, roughly speaking. And I've actually worked on a number of different topics within this period, even extending it into the medieval world and forward into the 19th century. I think a lot of my work always is, in some ways, a reflection, not necessarily a knee-jerk reaction, but a reflection of contemporary concerns. I did a book most recently on animal-human relationships and thinking about, in particular, the way in which animals are figured and represented in a political context in the courts of Louis XIV in France. I've also done a lot of work on immigration, on the history of nationality, on citizenship, all very hot topics, especially in France since the 1990s. But I started my career actually working on peasant rebellions. And that's what I'll be revisiting in part, talking to you today. So as I was starting to say here among the live voices, I started getting interested in collective resistance and rebellion in the 1970s at university. And at the time, the kind of history that we were reading to make sense of this was very much what are now the classics of a kind of history from below. So Eric Hobsbawm's Primitive Rebels, which came out in 1959, and E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, which came out in 1968. And then for me, in particular, the work of Natalie Davis, the American cultural historian, who collected her essays in a volume called Society and Culture in Early Modern France in 1973. And she had two essays in particular. One was called Women on Top, and the other was called The Rights of Misrule, R-I-T-E-S. And both of them were ways of thinking about moments of symbolic inversion in ritual and everyday life that produced alternative readings of the social order. So I got interested in Carnival through that, in particular because I was taken, obsessed even at the time, with a series of peasant rebellions.
Sorry.
A series of peasant rebellions that began in 1829 in the southern French department or region of the Ariège in the Pyrenees, and lasted at least the bulk of it for about 3 years, and coincided in part with the July Revolution of 1830 in Paris. And in one way, these were rebellions like any other, in the sense that they were peasant communities that mobilized to resist the imposition of a national forest code, the Forest Code of 1827, which specifically targeted their usufruct rights, their use rights to the forest, which included not just the ability or the necessity of gathering firewood and using the forest for building materials or for tools and instruments, but also the need to pasture their animals, herds of sheep for the most part, and goats in the forest, especially during this important transhuman cycle when the herds move up to the mountain pastures through the forest for some weeks, and then when they come back down in there. And the reason this is important is because this was a subsistence system, but it was not simply agricultural. It was pasto agricultural, in the sense that the keeping stock raising was essential to agriculture because of the dung that was harvested, especially in the forest, which was essential for the fertility of the otherwise quite barren and sterile agricultural lands. So it kind of made sense that they would revolt because there had been previous efforts to impose a kind of, call it the geometric spirit of forest management, these abstract universal conceptions of space, what Jim Scott called thinking like a state. And there had been an attempt in the 17th century to do this, but it had failed miserably because the peasant communities were largely protected by altitude, by distance, by the difficulty of access. And at the time, it didn't really make sense to push hard on the commercialization of the forest or of the wood and or secure for the king what the ordinance thought to do, which was the old growth forests to be used in naval construction. So the peasants had sort of escaped that, dodged that bullet, but by 1827, the pressures of a capitalist order were being felt, not just for the commercial exploitation of the wood, but also for the use of wood in the production of pig iron. So the region was dotted with these foundries. They're called Catalan forges, which consumed these vast quantities of wood. And they were owned by bourgeois inheritors or heirs of the great noble estates that they had picked them up during the French Revolution. And they were now really turning the screws and sort of pushing back. And so what the Forest Code did, besides universally prohibit everything that the peasants needed, was also to really formally prohibit and dismantle a whole system of forest management, that the ways in which in this local society over centuries, ecologically sound practices of forest management were put into place. And even though they looked like chaotic ways of managing the forest from the outside, they actually had this kind of inner logic to them, this eco-logic to them. And they were, in that sense, oh my, necessary to the peasant way of life. So, of course, one might say there was rebellion, and there were rebellions elsewhere in France. But what captured my attention and what got into my head or under my skin was these peasants who basically disguised themselves, or at least partially disguised themselves, with masks, with blackened faces, with cast-off military uniforms and the paraphernalia of armies and so on, but mostly with this disguise as women, which is why we call the events the War of the Demoiselles or the Maiden's War of the Young Maidens, which the disguise was just remarkably simple. They basically had these nice white linen shirts that they used on festive occasions. And so they took out these shirts, and instead of tucking them in, they wore them outside, and they tied a belt on the top, and it looked kind of like a dress. And so attired, they went into the forest, mostly at night, and in a very clamorous, noisy, and festive kind of revolt, they chased out the forest guards and the charcoal makers from the forest, and they scared them to death, quite literally. So it was not a violent rebellion. They were not shooting people. They were shooting the guns in the air. They were making noise. They were frightening them, and so on. So for me, that was the great problem: is how to explain the particular form that this rebellion took. So my journey into the forest and explaining this form, on the one hand, it took me deep into the effort to reconstruct an entire peasant universe, an entire cosmology that was, in our words, enchanted, animistic, that involved thinking of the forest in fact, not just material, but spiritual terms, and in identifying very much its feminine qualities, so that in part it was a question of tracking down the folk tales and traces of stories of these female fairies in the forest who actually were kind of a model for the rioters. They were vindictive. They exercised a kind of retributive justice. They were associated with fertility and the like. In part, it was tracking down ideas of the forest that had been dismantled by the scientific revolution in the 17th century, by what the historian of science Carolyn Merchant called the death of nature, which put into place a kind of inert matter that replaced very much an animistic, vitalist organic universe. And that in particular referred to the forest as a feminine being. So that was one track to explain this feminized and ritualistic notion. But there was another track which was even more fertile in this sense, and that was the one that led me to Carnival, which is, I take it now, the subject of our discussion tonight. So what became clear to me, and I wasn't the first to see it, was the way in which popular folk cultural festivities, and in particular the carnival, formed part of the repertoire on which peasants drew to legitimate, in their own minds, to legitimate their actions, their collective actions. And they orchestrated, in a very theatrical mode, a carnival beyond the bounds of seasonality, which had defined it, using the symbolism, the ritual practices, the tropes of inversion and so on, to really insist on the kind of subversive and elements of protest against the forest code. So it got me thinking about Carnival more generally, and I wanted to share one or two thoughts where maybe I can end after that and we can begin a discussion. So part of the problem as an historian studying Carnival, I mean, it's different if you're looking at Carnival today, if you're able to actually attend a Carnival and witness it, is that in history, Carnivals only get noticed when they're instrumentalized, when they're being used for something else. So, for example, when we talk about Bakhtin and Rabelais and Carnival, when we try to reconstruct the festive life of popular culture in the 15th and early 16th century, we're doing so through two sets of literary critics separated by 300, 400 years, who each have their own uses of Carnival. In other words, we're not approaching in any way, and we would be on a fool's errand to think that, as Bakhtin sometimes indicates to us, that Rabelais is a kind of transparent window onto popular culture. You're scary. I'm not gonna I mean, he's not. It's mediated in all sorts of projects of Rabelais, most of which have nothing to do with popular culture, right? Nonetheless, teasing out the sources, teasing out the filters, allows us to see what uses he is making of it, right? And in the same way, with this peasant revolt, I'm able to see the ways in which, again, it's instrumentalized as a set of practices with another goal in mind. In this case, the goal of rebellion or resistance. Now, that's not to say that it's not possible to imagine and to think about Carnival except through these mediations. And in fact, in my own experience and in the book that I did do on this that came out in 1994, one of the ways in which I did it was to think about Carnival in a comparative ethnographic context and to compare it with, in fact, a whole series of calendrical ritual celebrations among societies as far-fetched as Melanesians celebrating Mila Mila and the Swazi in Africa celebrating the Inkawala. These were big sort of cosmic celebrations at the end of the year that marked the passing between the death of winter and the birth of spring. They were tied to fertility, but they were also very much expressions of what the classicist Georges Demoiselles called the dual representation of sovereignty. And here for me was a really interesting way of starting to think about Carnival, which actually has its echoes very much, and I was so pleased to read them in David Graeber's work, in his prehistorical work, if you will, on the origins of everything, in which he talked about, at one point, the kind of seasonality of sovereignty as a moment in which cultures, societies could experiment without necessarily locking in to one form of sovereignty or another. My own interpretation was much more structural and much less improvisational than his, and it was very much informed in some ways by a kind of classic structuralism of Lévi-Strauss and of Demoiselle himself in the 70s. And it was about thinking of Carnival very much as a moment within a festive cycle of sovereignty in which the calendar year was itself structured in a way to forefront at different moments these different articulations or expressions of sovereignty. One that was youthful, creative, subversive, the world upside down, the Carnivalesque. The other was, following Demoiselles' lead, the world of gravitas, of seriousness, of state hierarchy, of rigidity, and so on. So, of the many things that I might say about Bakhtin's reading, of Rabelais' reading of the Carnival, one of the things that I miss in Bakhtin, whom I adore, but for not necessarily the obvious reasons, but one of the things I miss in his understanding of Carnival is very much the importance of seasonality and the importance of the temporal dimension of Carnival as it's celebrated at a particular moment within the festive cycle. It's really interesting that Bakhtin himself virtually ignores or passes over the one episode, especially in book 3, in which a carnival is really positioned as a seasonal festival. For him, the seasonality is not there. It's not about season, it's about structure. It's about the way the Carnivalesque appears wherever, in the marketplace, at the fair, in these different spaces, but not necessarily tied or linked to the calendar season. So for him, the whole idea of a festive moment, structured between Fat Tuesday and Lent, and then expanded often to include 3 or 4 months, if not half the year, doesn't resonate in his theory. His theory is much more about the spaces of the Carnivalesque than the timing of the Carnivalesque. So, show you in there? I'll stop there. There's obviously more to say, but okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Peter. And yeah, so oh my God, it's like people waiting. Yeah, for somebody who come just now, Peter just finished his short introduction to Carnival and to his book. And yeah, maybe, hey, Vera, yeah, happy Halloween. So I don't know, should we start discussion? How would we do that? If anybody have questions, who was like, oh yeah, I see something. I can't hear well. Oh, the sound is not really working, huh?
Okay.
Was the sound working, guys?
Well, there's reading going on.
Huh? Okay. Okay.
Okay, I can try and turn it on.
So.
1 second.
So while we, yeah, so I don't know who, if anybody wants to talk, maybe just start or put up the hand. Yeah, or I can ask questions.
Oh, as well, 69.
Yeah,
Oh.
I know that
Sorry.
Claire has a lot of experience with Carnival and Carnivalesque in real life, and yeah, maybe it will be good to talk to somebody who actually did a lot in carnivals.
I do also have a question.
Yeah.
As the first one. Yeah, so
Wait, just a second. Claire, are you talking? I don't hear. Wait.
No, I'm not speaking. I'll let the person in the ghoulish room speak first, and then I'll say something.
Yeah, just for some, it was very interesting what you were saying about seasonality, but I just wanted some clarification about what the kind of connotations are that you want to draw out there. And there was an interesting moment. I've not seen anyone write about it where, I mean, he says all kinds of things, but like a month ago, Trump in one of his speeches said something like, when I'm president, we'll have one day where anyone can do anything they want.
Well,
And it's interesting that, like, as part of his actual, obviously very top down, he is going to be authoritarian, but don't worry, everyone, you're going to have one day. But there's one kind of view of, because seasonality, I think it's interesting because there's a kind of inevitability there that isn't to do with, yeah, this kind of beyond any particular local happenings. And I wondered whether you're saying that it's almost like an emergent property of societies, or is it almost like a necessity that anyone who is in this position of royalty or a Trump figure, in order to sustain their power, they do it? Or we've got the space of the forest that's just always been there as part of society, and it's this kind of bottom up season in the sense that it almost like a natural structure.
right. Well, I think the reference to Trump is interesting, but it refers really to a modern, post-agrarian, post-industrial world in which what he's playing with is his capacity to actually structure the calendar. The kind of calendrical festivities that I was referring to are not subjected to this discretionary authority of the ruler. Or if they are, that's one of the uses then to which festivity could be made. Banning carnival, for example. in order to assert power. But these again are kind of structured collective rituals and practices independent of any choice of sovereign in that regard, which present in very much theatrical form, but not theatrical in the sense of dividing spectators and participants, but theatrical in the sense of dramatizing the principles at stake. These festivities very much take place, in a kind of coherent and unfolding logical order then that gets repeated the next year and repeated the next year and next year and so on. So again, for me, the contrasted interpretation would be less with, a kind of modern wannabe dictator's attempt to reinstitute or to regulate this, than interrogating, well, what does it mean? And here I'm having this conversation in my head with David, which is, his argument that it presents every year a set of possibilities about the way in which political order might be organized. It's useless to say and try to judge, is it subversive? Is it conservative? Those are the wrong questions. It's both and at once. It kind of depends on to what ends it's being instrumentalized in that sense. But what's important, in David's work for David was the fact that it happened and that it presented on an annual basis this opening of space where people could imagine other possible worlds like that. In my view, I'm not saying that's wrong by any means, but I want to structure it even more. I don't want to think of it as just, a kind of open space of experimentation, which I think it is. But I think it stands in some important structural relationship to what goes on the rest of the year. And that the alternance between these modes of governance, between hierarchical authoritarian forms of rule and these bottom-up, world upside-down, carnivalesque things, is an important way in which sovereignty is actually constituted in a society. They're necessary parts of the same equation. They don't exist antagonistically or independently of each other. I know it's a little abstract, and
Can I
apologize for that.
Can I explore that? I mean, my experience was not an academic one of Carnival. It was of discovering Caribbean Carnival in London when I was quite young, back in the 70s. And one of the things for the carnivalists that I worked with was that it wasn't about the day. The Carnival Day was just an event that happened in public. But the real carnival was the mass camp. And the mass camp was the masquerade camp, the place where you built carnival, where you would spend months before carnival building up to it. Mm. And in a sense, the mass camp was the inversion of the industrial production place, because it was a place where people went after work, voluntarily, unpaid, to chat, smoke dope, make things, to do things, learn skills. And actually, it was a very physical inversion of an industrial space. And I think that just looking at Carnival as an event on the street misses out, because if you don't spend time in mass camps, you don't see that kind of, you don't experience it. And I think that inversion happens over a long time in preparation to Carnival. And I mean, now I think perhaps many of those elements have disappeared as youth clubs kind of, sanitize that experience.
Or sorry to interrupt you, or like in this discussion in St. Vincent about Carnival, you remember the local people were saying that the Chinese are coming with like super like glorious things that you can buy online, and all this like Carnivalesque workshops, they just dying out because it's too complicated to
So there's a
deal.
transformation going on, but I just want to broaden that point that carnival is not necessarily, or the carnival I experience, not necessarily just that event, but it's all the things and the social dynamics that surround it and make it.
If nobody has anything, I really appreciate that point, because what it does for me is to help understand how Carnival survives even in a modern world where it's performed for spectators, where the division between audience and celebrants is very marked. So I've been to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and it's striking, the barriers put up, and I never thought about the back end, as it were, and the way in which, and we were talking earlier about prefiguration, the way in which it's actually put together.
Many carnivalists are asleep during carnival. They're just exhausted.
Yeah.
Just wait, just sorry, like it was Claire, yeah.
I'm not sure that that's necessary. I'm not sure that that's. I totally agree with you about process, but my background is in creating big public feasts that take over public spaces on bridges and in huge public areas in London, and people grow food and they take the time to look at the relationships between the celebration and the growing cycle and the reunification of culture and agriculture. And then they take up public space in order to cook and prepare and to eat that food together. And that's all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And it takes like a year in order to prepare it and do it and whatever. And although I agree with you, John, about the process, I don't agree that you necessarily have to have that difference between participant and audience in something like that. And I think that you can create spaces even now where you're in a non-romantic way, bringing together the relationship between the growing cycle and the celebration, and that there's enough of that still kind of exists, whatever the form is now, that allows people to tap into that in their imagination and to have a time that's outside of anything else and create new public memory around those kinds of things, especially if you're in a space that's normally taken up with cars and business and whatever. But I'm just interested in the instrumentalization as well, because I wonder what you think about something like the Rebel Clown Army that came out of the road protest movement in the UK, and whether that instrumentalization of something that is kind of carnivalesque, that I think is actually super clever when you use it in that type of resistance, is something that you think. I can't quite tell what you're saying about instrumentalization, whether you think that that's something that slightly bastardizes the form in some way.
No, not at all, actually. I'm not particularly familiar with the case, though I do think I know what you're referring to. There's nothing negative in the way I'm using the term instrumentalization. There's nothing that I'm intending to take away from Carnival or from all that it represents. My remark was only based on the fact that, as an historian, when I get to read about Carnival in the archival sources, I read about it because it's been instrumentalized in some way or another. That is, ordinary Carnival that's celebrated year in and year out in peasant communities and urban settings or whatever escapes from the archives because nobody has a problem with it. Nobody tries to do anything with it. When a carnival is repressed or when a carnival is used in a context of rebellion, that's when it becomes present. It leaves traces, it becomes visible. Mm-hmm. So the observation was only about that to begin with. It's not about the non-instrumental existence of Carnival, but it's about how, as an historian, I can come to study it through the filters which themselves mark its instrumentalization.
Wait.
Oh.
Wait. Yep.
I was wondering about Saturnalia, because I think I was looking up about Rabelais, and I think that's mentioned in it. Apparently it was the most popular celebration before Christianity in Europe, a lot of Europe. And one of the things they did was they made these joke gifts. So like they would give sort of joke gifts, you know, spend time making them, and then give these joke things to their friends and family. And it was an insult to have something kind of well made or anything. It was always sort of derogatory,
Right.
You know, insults to them, because that showed that they were close enough to sort of, you know, didn't make an insult, but keep friends, you know. So, and then that became our Christmas,
Right.
you know, and
Really?
yeah.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Where the presents come from.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
From
So-
South.
Yeah,
Oh,
they apparently it's the one festival that they couldn't cancel because it was so popular. So they made Christ's birth on that day, or, you know, around the day. I don't know, like, is that
Saturnalia is also an inversion, because
It was.
it's where the lords of the house
Was.
behave as servants to the servants.
And it was also a youth-led set of celebrations. It was taken away, as it were, as a civic celebration from the magistrates, from the town authorities, and it was really orchestrated by informal associations of young people. But it corresponds. So when I talk about Carnival as a calendrical festival, I mean, there's a broad and narrow sense to that. The narrow sense is, if you follow, strictly speaking, the Christian calendar, and then Carnival becomes the period, the 40 days before Lent, from Fat Tuesday until Lent, and so that's variable according to the year and so on. When I was looking at peasant society and trying to make sense of the festive calendar over the course of the year, I saw that activities that were enacting the Carnivalesque, that is, inversion, laughter, the world upside down, subversion, false kings, false trials, false gifts, all of the parodies of the institutions of high culture, that they really went from late November, early December, through Christmas. And so, through Easter and beyond, to include the May festivals, which we have remnants of even in modern society, as May Day, Maypoles and the like, which were also youth-driven festivals that were very much orchestrated around issues of fertility and reproduction. In other words, it was the winter season, right? Basically December to May. And those festivals, which included Carnival, which included Easter, which was, you know, until the 17th century was the beginning of the year, and which itself, and here you have to correct Bakhtin a little bit, because Easter laughter, the inversion festivities surrounding Easter, in which the clerics would be displaced in the church by young men who would set up parodies of the Christian rituals, were actually condoned and tolerated as part of the calendrical cycle of feasts like that. They were not prohibited until the late 16th and 17th century. So the Feast of Fools is what he calls it generically in Rabelais' world. So that whole cycle stood very much opposed in rural society to the cycle of feasts which took place from the early summer until November, which were the patron saint festivals. And I went and I actually counted, the number in a given region and plotted the patron saint festivals on the calendar. It turns out, they're clustered in August and then in October and then St. Martin's Day, November 11th and so on. And those festivals, although they have elements of the Carnivalesque, every festival does, were predominantly structured by the village authorities, the village priests, the hierarchy, orchestrating the kind of official version of society, as it were. So when I talk about the contrast, and when I'm asking Bakhtin to think more about, which is the temporal understanding of Carnival, it's not to restrict Carnival to that short liturgical cycle, but to understand that even though the Carnivalesque might appear in the fairs, which are outside of the cycle, or in the marketplace or whatever, that the principal structuring principles of the organization of festive activities divide the year into two.
But isn't that to a large degree because for we in industrial society, to imagine that winter is the holiday is a bit difficult. We go on holiday in the summer. But for the agrarian society, you work through the summer and then winter comes and you've got to entertain yourself in one way or another. That potentially begins to explain why the peasants organize their festivals themselves in the winter,
Right.
but the other festivals are organized top down during the summer.
Yeah, but yeah, so what's also very interesting, if I may ask question, is I would like you to talk about this political language and this change of perspective. And you, like when we were talking before, you were talking about three very major points. One about reclaiming the rights to refer to the history for left, that is now right-wing people only have. Yeah, in Russia we have this something called skrepe. How would you translate that? Skrepe, yeah, something like a chain, like I don't know how some like this is an official language, so of power. We are representing the tradition, the real humanity, the way how we all should live, and so on. And yeah, so the Carnivalesque with like a very different idea of what is human being and what is the relationship between humans and society is actually like super historical things happens in every society in the world. So that's one thing, and then it was another two.
We'll go with the other two. Let's hear.
Yeah, the second one was what we were talking about, changing political language. That is happening in any way, but basically, like you were saying, we have to be very explicit about attacking our enemies. That is, this rationalism that happens in 1700s. That is kind of, defeated this enchanted universe and the forest as a metaphor of a different way of living. So that's the political language is like very important thing that I would like to talk. But then the third thing is exactly about this enchanted universe and how should we relate to that, because we all people from industrial societies, we had this like I get a Soviet education. Like when I hear somebody talking about fairies, I'm just like it's difficult for me to kind of to find a way to relate to that.
I think
If we can jump, on your point, on your first point about the historical connection, if you look at Western African societies where there are modern carnivals as well, there is a big carnival called Harcourt. And we can see that like a bit of an evolution of the traditional masquerades that are instead like all the traditional rites, and they're more seen now in a more modern lens. So I think like in the European society it's a bit trickier to see, but in the African countries there is much more of a link.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I've never been there, so I don't have any clue about that.
I mean, I think all of your points speak to the question broadly that's being posed in the third one, which is how do we develop alternative ways of thinking and acting when the world has passed them by? That is a scientific revolution, modern society, and so on. And, I'm not advocating in any way for just this kind of simple enactment of a golden age in the past, but I do think that all of us, even as moderns, in different ways, whether it's in the Freudian world of dreams or the festive world of carnival, acknowledge at different moments in our lives realities and ideas and eventually practices which are not contained in the world of abstract universal reason. I mean, entire industries would be out of practice if we all really believed that and lived in that way. So the question is how to capture the irrationality, as it were, and harness it for productive political purposes. And there, it seems to me that, festivity has an important role to play. So we'll just say that provocatively and see what happens.
Claire?
Can I ask you if you think that there's contemporary youth culture that is creating that now? I mean, like, do you think I don't know, I'm showing my age now, but something like rave culture, is that equivocable in any way to the idea of carnival that you, in the way that you're talking about it?
Well, I think I'm even further from it than you are. And
there are masks that are being used in raves, and it's more like I think about to hide from other people.
Rave is to hide?
Like in a certain sense, because when they use masks, they really cover themselves up, and there is nothing that you can see in their faces. So I think in a certain sense, it's not like to share, but like more to separate themselves from the rest. That's how I saw them. But
Yeah. Well, from what I hear, I mean, rave culture with its supportive pharmacological elements, like Molly, is about dissolving the boundaries of, everyday life and relations and finding some kind of collective joy and experience. Now, is that Carnivalesque? Is it the same thing as Carnival? Not sure, but it certainly presents itself as an alternative in that way. Is it productive of,
What's productive?
productive in the sense of empowering, in the sense of socially effective or consequential in that sense? Does it change anything? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm too far from that world to pass judgment. But one can always be hopeful, right?
But actually, Clive and I was talking recently, and he was saying that whatever Extinction Rebellion did on these bridges was definitely a carnival. First of all, people all dress up, you know, and like it was definitely clearly a disturbance of the existing order. And all, like, I think if you have a checklist of what is Carnivalesque, that will pass. So, oh, I want to show you something. We have here John. We don't have Clive. Maybe he's online. I don't know. But so this is an apartment art exhibition that is opening tomorrow, called Carnival Not War. Maybe I should go downstairs and show it better. But like now it will be in the 5 minutes, it will start a reading group in another Zoom about Bahktin, but then we were thinking today with Clive that if you compare design and contemporary art, in a way, design is very much, according to Bahktin, Carnivalesque and not, sorry, I just drink too much wine. So according to Bahktin, the high culture is inherently romantic, and folk culture is not. So that's like we were like thinking about distinction between design and contemporary art, and had some thoughts, but maybe I'm too it's too quickly for me to formalize them. So should we close this session because we have a reading group soon?
We have what?
Reading group.
Oh, I thought
Yeah, so we did it like twice. Yeah. Oh my God, somebody like wrote a long comment. Oh, Shlomo, you have a question? Hey, sorry about that. There's also a question, maybe you can.
Yeah, I'm reading.
Shlomo?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes?
My question was basically, you know how Notting Hill Carnival started as a protest and Pride started as a protest? Do you think that it's a shame that we sometimes we forget about that? That's my question.
But it's not always a protest, right? I mean, it can be, and when it is, we tend to fixate on it and applaud it and celebrate it. But I guess the way I was trying to think about it is that when it's a protest, that's when we're, or whoever is instrumentalizing it and using it for something. Now, it turns out it can be used for something because it has a character that may lend itself to those uses, but that doesn't mean that that character of the thing in and of itself is a protest or is subversive. The uses to which it's put can be, often are, not always, but it's not inherent in the thing. So I guess that's where I'm distancing myself a little bit from a more strict, Bakhtinian interpretation.
Can I answer that? So I think that there are many versions of how and why Notting Hill Carnival began. And if you speak to different carnivalists, you have very, very different answers. I have one friend who was one of the first carnivalists, and he talks about talking to some of the Black Panther people in Notting Hill at that time who were talking about guns. And his response was, we don't need guns, we need music and laughter, because that will unite people. Peter Minshall, who was a Trinidadian carnivalist, who was one of the first people to put a costume ban on the streets of London, he deliberately made the faces many colours, because what he didn't want to do was create a carnival that was Afro-Caribbean or anything. He wanted it to be a carnival that anybody could come to. If you talk to every carnivalist who was around at the time, they probably have a different story for how it started. And I think that really is the spirit of carnival.